So thanks for coming out. I think just as a starting point, we just want to thank you for joining us with this 5th annual Denver Startup Week. And want to give a big shout out to the sponsors that make this possible. So Comcast for Business, Chase for Business, Downtown Denver Business Partnership, and then you guys, this is the Product Track Talk, which is sponsored by MapQuest. And so we just want to give them a shout out, and really the design of this is to have 6 different entrepreneurial tracks to touch everyone in entrepreneurism on your whole team. So thanks for coming out. A little bit of my background, my name is Ken Kelly, and I've started a couple companies right now, actively manage 2 companies that are here local based in Denver. One's called Never Settle, and we're a digital agency. We build web-based and software-based solutions for businesses. And then we also started a cause-based company called Osana, and we manufacture an all-natural mosquito repellent soap. So we have a corporate mission to eliminate the preventable deaths caused by mosquito-borne illnesses globally. And with that, it's kind of like Tom's Shoes model. Every time you buy a package, we ship one overseas to our village partners suffering from malaria, Zika, dengue, all that. So what I'm going to share with you is really a collaboration of our team's effort over the last 6 years and how we've applied lean and the things that we've learned along the way in both of those companies, and how it's, our failures and how it's helped us, and some of the standard methodology that we've built to get us to this point. So with that, who here is, I'm assuming most people, but who here is familiar with either lean startup or lean manufacturing? Okay, so most of us, but not everyone. I'm going to touch on a couple points just to make sure we're all using the same jargon and terminology throughout this. But we will go ahead and dive in. So, if this will work. There we go. So, why does this matter? Lean has become a buzzword, and especially the startup community, but I'd say even in the business community, some of the consulting I've done, some of the larger businesses talk a lot about lean, talk a lot about Six Sigma, but how are we actively using it? So last year when I was here at Denver Startup Week, a lot of people were just like throwing around MVP and pivots, and we're a lean company and we're doing this. But the more I talk with people, the more I realize they aren't really sure how to implement lean at a company level or a project level or a personal project level. And so that's kind of where we're going to dive in. While the process is pretty simple, it's not actually covered in lean's methodology. So it's kind of interesting. It talks a lot about creating accountable metrics, creating tests, but it doesn't give you kind of a standard methodology of how you're going to actually implement that in your company. And so we want to find a tangible way of doing this and going lean inside a company. And yeah, I think I have a lot of notes here. I'm just trying to. Yeah, I think the critical element here is your ability to measure the results of your assumptions and choices. And I'm going to dive a lot into assumptions. I think we make a lot more assumptions in our company and on a day-to-day level than maybe we realize. So we need a way of validating that and measuring it, and then making a decision based off of that. And yeah, I think we'll yeah, that'll be it. So so why it matters is all of your business is based on data and making the right decisions. And if you're looking at the wrong data, you're going to make the wrong decision, which is kind of black and white. So how all this came about for us and where we're going with this is we were introduced to lean about 6 years ago, and for me it transformed everything that I looked at. So I'd started a company in Silicon Valley. I raised $9 million in VC funding, and we spent almost 2.5 years building a product to bring it to market. And after that 2.5 years, we finally got it in front of our customer, and we did fairly well. But then take the 5 years later, I'm introduced to lean, and I'm looking back at what we did, and I'm seeing how much resources, time, everything we wasted by trying to build this perfect product for our customer, and we never got the feedback to find out what do they really want. And so we did okay, but looking back, there were so many things we could have done better and made better use of our time and our money. So that's where I was introduced to it about 6 years ago in 2010, and then we implemented it in our company here at Never Settle in Denver about 4 years ago, and we were kind of intermittently using it, and we were is that the MVP, and all this jargon. But we weren't actually systematically using it throughout the company. And then 2 years ago, we actually got to the point where we had we fully adopted it, top to bottom of the company. We're using it in every single thing. And how it started for us is one of my business partners was, he had this crazy idea of let's build a product a week. And if you guys need more seating, there's a bunch of chairs on that side of the room that they didn't bring over. So feel free to grab a chair. And he came to our board meeting, was like, hey, I think we should develop a product a week. Like, we're lean, we know how to make MVPs, we want to be a products company. So we're a digital agency and we're wanting to shift to be a products company at that time. And he's like, let's do a product a week. And we do all these crazy experiments all the time. And so my other partner was like, yeah, I'd love to do it. And I was thinking like, yeah, let's go. And he's like, let's do one a week for a year. And we were looking at our board like, okay, it would certainly make us a products company because we had 52 products a year later. But the feasibility of that seemed impossible. So we started talking through it and we ended up landing on, let's do it for 3 months. Like, can we flex our muscles and can we come up with a new idea, build a product, get it in front of our customer, and then take it to market and market it? And can we do this 12 times in a row every week? And so we set out to do it, and along the way we completed it. And in the end, we wrote an ebook about it called 12 Products in 12 Weeks, pretty simple. And what we found is a few weeks into it that when we were like repetitively doing this exercise of building a product from A to Z, and obviously these weren't enterprise software products. Some of them were pretty big, some of them were pretty simple. But we were doing this, we realized we really need a way to validate our assumptions and some sort of documentation, a standard process for us to create our tests and to validate what we're doing. So along the way, that's kind of where this came out of, and one of the reasons that we test so much was during this time of building those 12 products in 12 weeks. And the kind of a side note to that is we had to be extremely productive on what we were doing. So as a company, we have a policy that no one can work more than 40 hours a week. So 4 years ago, I wrote an article, and I was kind of challenged coming out of Silicon Valley and coming back to Denver, Colorado native, and I got a chance to come back here. Challenging like the status quo of like just work harder, put more hours in, and like race the startup next to you of how much you can output. And so we did an experiment at that time, and it was like, can a startup be profitable and only work 40 hours a week? And that was 4 years ago, and then so now we're a little over 4 years since I wrote that, and still doing really, really well. And so we've been able to do it, and we did the 12 products in 12 weeks inside of that framework. So we kept 40-hour weeks, and we maintained our services client load. So I think what I've found is that if you have the right testing tools, the right methodology, and you keep it simple, you can actually make a lot of progress and not overcomplicate it. So what is lean? I want a little bit of participation from the audience. Like, if you could summarize it, like, what would you say lean is?
Only the important stuff.
What's that? Only the important stuff. Yep.
Customer driven.
Yep. Customer driven. What was that?
Iterative.
Iterative. Yep. Iterative testing, iterative development. Yep. That's good. When I was trying to think, how would I summarize this and just kind of like pulling this right from Eric Ries and kind of the standard, right, is you're starting with building. So you're going to build a product, then you're going to measure it, and then you're going to take validated learnings from that. And so that in itself, that's like Lean's, if you were to, like the 3 pillars that Lean stands on is build, measure, learn. But what it's specific in is it says continue to do that, right? So build, measure, learn, and then take those learnings and apply it to the next thing that you're building or the next reiteration. And it's this idea of continuous deployment, continuous development. So again, to talk about making sure we're all on the same, if I use any of these words, I want to make sure we're all on the same thing throughout the rest of the talk. So MVP, minimum viable product, most people probably know that, but using the minimum amount of resources to create a viable product, to get it in front of your customer, to get feedback for the thing you're wanting to validate. Accountable metrics, so having metrics that allow you to take action on something, not just fluff metrics, but metrics that define a decision for you. Continuous development, iterative is what we talked about as well, but the idea here, that in itself is the circle, right? So build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn, build, measure, learn, never stop doing it. Measurable accounting, so creating a new type of accounting system that has a measurement to it that can validate your assumptions. Then you have your leap of faith assumption. This is probably my favorite part, one of the things I've realized more and more, that we have more assumptions in business than we ever expect, and I'll unpack that a little bit, but your leap of faith assumption. So what is the thing that you're building your product or the next version or your company on? You're making some massive assumption, and you're really putting all your faith into that assumption, and you're building something around it. So knowing what that is really critical. And then a pivot. So as we build, measure, learn, we get validated learning. And if anybody needs more chairs, there's like 200 on that side as well. As we build, measure, learn, along the way we may need to take a pivot, and not to be afraid of that, but to embrace it and realize that at some point, if we're doing the wrong thing, it's much better to take a pivot and move down a different path or make a slight change. So that'd be the word pivot. And then the last one, split testing. So within testing, not just testing a general metric, but having a baseline and being able to test something against something else. So two things. So instead of false positive testing, A/B testing, and being able to test the difference between two things, see which one outperforms the other. False positive is great. It'll validate something, but if you can A/B test, and for this, I'm not going to dive into multivariate testing, but A/B testing is super valuable because you don't just see false positive, you get false positive and which one's better. So for me, to kind of I wrote this down in kind of two summaries for this talk to kind of like make it apply to most people. And if I were to summarize lean of why this matters, the first thing I would say is creating a viable product, and viable being the operative word there. So viable meaning that the customer can use it, they can provide feedback to me, and it's solving one of their problems. So viable product with the least amount of resources needed to validate my assumptions and gain customer feedback. And then another way of saying this, if you're not a business owner, but like in personal life or personal projects you're doing or you're individual contributor, would be getting answers to your business questions using the smallest amount of resources needed to answer that question or solve that challenge. So we're going to look at a very overly simplified graph here. And we're going to look at our assumptions and our reality and why this idea of having a testing framework is important. So typically you're going along and through time, and if you're doing well, that's great. You're kind of like up and to the right slightly. You're not failing, but you're not doing great. But you learn about lean. And so we've seen this with a lot of people that we've gotten to help, and they find out about lean, and then they realize like all the areas in their business that they need to improve, and so they decide they're going to take this dramatic action, implement lean, and they're going to do an MVP, and they're going to test it and all this stuff, and they're going to figure out like how to make their company really succeed. And so at a point in time, they take that action, and they have this very strategic plan, and they implement it. And because of that, their assumption is that after we do this, everything is going to be up and to the right. And what reality ends up being for a lot of people is there's a slight blip, but really if you were to average that graph out or standardize it, it would be basically the same trajectory as it was before. And so they implement it, they don't get the results they want, and so they stop doing it. And typically it's because they have a bad mechanism of testing their assumptions that need to be validated. So as they're going along that path, typically we found that most of the great ideas people have are really valuable. So probably 90% of it is actually a game changer for their company. But when they go back to look at their results and say, okay, what did we do right? What did we do wrong? They don't have the right metrics to look at, or they don't have the right framework with to look at it. So they kind of throw out the whole thing and think like this didn't work. But really they're measuring the wrong metrics. And so I'm going to give a more practical example about that. So that's typically for a lot of people what we've found is that they take this huge point, they're expecting something and really nothing happens, and then they move on. The second one is your reality is you are going along a straight line, and your company's doing okay. Your company hits a specific point in time, or you as a person or whatever, and so there's a point of action that takes that you may or may not know. So you don't have to be aware of it for this to happen, but your assumption is because you haven't really done much that you're going to continue down this path. So it's going to just kind of continue and just slight growth and a few ups and downs. But the reality is you have this major shift and this huge upturn. The reason it's critical on both the previous one and this one is you need to know how to create the previous one and what caused this one, right? So if you're, and we see people do this a lot, and sometimes it's a failure as well. So even understanding your failures is just as important. But the reason that this is so critical to understand this particular point of action that happened is that you want to be able to reproduce it, right? So no metric's ever going to continue to have hyper growth without constant input into it. And so you need to know what did we do right and how can we reproduce it. And so that's why finding that is really important. And like I said, this is hyper simplified for the purpose of illustration. So being able to just kind of state where our assumptions and our realities sit most times. So what we need is a testing framework, right? Which is what this is all about. One of the core principles of Lean is not having a strict set of principles, right? So it's a methodology. It's not a how-to guide. So you take Lean, you see what you can learn from it, you apply those principles to your business, and you modify them, and you make them fit for you. So same thing with this test. So I'm going to show you a testing tool that we developed. It's a free resource for anyone. You can use it, you can not. It doesn't really matter to us, but you have to have a testing framework. Like if you don't, it's kind of pointless to be trying to do Lean without it. So highly recommend having a testing framework, and then just like Lean, applying it to your business, like what fits. So I think about like SEAL Team 6 guys, when they get their guns, every single one, they all get the same gun, right? They all get an M4, but they put custom ops on it. It puts custom specs, hand grips, barrels, everything. They make it fit for them so that they can do battle in a way that fits best for them. So I would encourage you with that. Like as you're seeing things you like take it, adapt it, modify it for you or for your company. Not having a framework is not an option is kind of what I covered. I don't think you can succeed trying to implement Lean without having some sort of framework and consistency. And it doesn't have to be perfect, so this is a great rule for 80-20%, the 80-20 rule. And I think about this when you're doing technology solutions too. So a lot of people are looking for technologies to implement in their business. And when I did consulting, we were doing big ERP systems for Fortune 100. We never tried to find the perfect technology because it's a never-ending quest to really find it. There's so many options. We wanted to find one that solved about 80% of the problems, and then everything we focused on was standardization and consistency. So same thing with testing. Find a tool that does most of it, but what's going to make the tool successful for you is being able to standardize it across your company or the people that are doing it with you and being consistent at using it. So the reason standardization is important is that you're going to have, as you grow, it allows organic growth easily. So everyone's using something the same way. You bring in new staff, they can train the other people. Everyone's using a consistent language. The other thing it does is it creates accountability. So if everyone says, we agree, this is how we're going to use it, then everyone's accountable to the same standard that you've set. So, and that's really what makes tools really successful, and it's kind of just the basics of implementing any technology tool. This isn't a technology, but it applies the same. And then consistency. If you decide to do one Lean startup experiment and then you don't do another one for 6 months, you're really not going to get the benefit of what Lean is about, because it's about continuous development and continually improving and learning from your last test and applying it to your next assumption or your next MVP. So here's some, again, I made everything pretty simple. So this is a table from a real customer. It's real customer data, but the table is very simplified. This is a retail store, and what they wanted to do is they wanted to figure out where is our marketing spend going. So they want to determine what's their ROI per marketing channel. And so like, okay, well, we need to capture data and analytics, and then from that we can determine what's producing the most ROI, and then we know we'll invest more into that and we'll cut back on the places that have the lowest ROI. So they started taking polls. Every customer that came in the door, they asked, hey, how'd you hear about us? And then they make a tally mark and they would decide where the customer came. And then at the end of the month, they'd have their tallies. This is how many people we brought in from these different referral sources. Then from the P&L, they can pull in their revenue, right? So they have their revenue that they're getting each month, and they can pull that in. And then they're making correlations and saying, we want to determine, how much revenue we're bringing in per customer. And so they took those metrics, and then they also took all these other metrics. And I didn't put the tables on here because it would have been gross, but the point is that's actually not valuable. So we can look at all those other metrics that they were capturing. And so they were taking their gross profit, sales by product, sales by day, sales by rep, their margin, their average sale price, their profit per customer. And none of those metrics are actually helpful in them solving the question that they're trying to answer. So they're trying to figure out what's my return on investment per marketing channel. And so they start taking all this data, and they get their sales guys to fill out all of this. And they have these incredible graphs and this incredible, all this data, and it looks like, man, we really know what we're doing as a business, and yet the one question they're trying to answer never gets solved. And the reason this breaks down, so we can take all that aside, and you start looking at this, and what we realize is this is where, hopefully you can relate to this, you'll see how they started making a lot of assumptions. And this is what I find in my own work each day. Like, wow, like there's a lot of things I'm assuming. I don't actually know. I'm just kind of making a bunch of assumptions. So big assumption number one, every customer bought, right? So if they think we have 250,000 in revenue, we had a total of 100 customers, and let's say 50 of those came from Google. If they assume that 125,000 in revenue came from Google, there's a few assumptions going on there. One, all 100 customers bought. Two, all customers bought at the same price point. Three, all 50 of Google's customers bought. And so in that, as you can see, all three of those are kind of silly at the best word I could use would be, like foolish to make that type of assumption. So they're looking at it and they're saying, okay, Google's working for us. We brought in 50 customers, it's 125,000 revenue. Our spend on it was 30,000, so we're having a pretty good ROI. Let's invest more in that. And as you can see, that there's nothing that's validated from like a lean perspective that's not validated learning. It looks like it because we have data and we have numbers and we're making good decisions. So being able to ask yourself, like, what's the main question you're trying to ask and making sure you have the right metrics to do it. The other thing that this falls apart in, and this is where you get into like using the right tools for yourself and the right testing methodology, is let's say that we could track, and they did better, and instead of tracking customers, they tracked how much revenue per customer. Then we would say, okay, that solves the question we're trying to get. We're trying to figure out how much revenue comes in per marketing channel. That breaks apart as well. So in retail, you have things like coupons, refunds, returns, exchanges. And if, let's say that they determined that these 50 customers brought in 200,000 of their revenue. So like, okay, it's not a one-for-one customer. Google really is dominating. What if those 50 customers, 95% of them return? Then it's a totally poor metric, right? So they're looking at it and they're seeing on their baseline, they're seeing sales or profit or revenue of 200,000. But when you actually look at it, if 95% of that's taken away, 180,000 of that isn't actually received, right? But you wouldn't know because you're taking the metric at the front end. So having a system that allows you to take metrics at the front, the middle, and the back to get comprehensive data set or your customer value or whatever that may be for you is really, really important. So this is something I get really excited about because I think understanding where your marketing spend is something that transforms businesses overnight if you can actually determine like what's bringing in your revenue and you take in all factors like returns, exchanges, coupons, all that. So with that, we built a point of sale tool actually for retail franchises, and my favorite report in there is like the customer referral source report, so we can see what customers are driving revenue, how do we incentivize them, and it's all in a contained system so we can track the coupons, refunds, exchanges, all that. So anyways, this is a great point of know your question that you're trying to answer, and then make sure you have the right metrics. Just having metrics, I would challenge you to really press into them to see if they're answering the question you're really trying to solve. And what I found a lot of times in helping people with lean is they have metrics that seem like they're answering the right question, but they're not actually. So last thing is to don't overthink it. So I'm going to show you our tool. It's crazy simple. It's a spreadsheet. It's not rocket science. Keeping it simple allows you to keep your tests small and allows you to do them in a short amount of time, which is also really important for gaining momentum with your team. And so this is one of the tools that we have. This is a big printout. That's almost to size. And so we have spreadsheets and this printout, and people can download it for free or whatever. But hyper simple, as you can see. There's no proprietary information here on this, right? It's just a way of keeping it in front of us as a team and doing them. So if you're a company that has more than one product, the one thing to know is to have one of these or whatever you're going to use per product. So if you only have one product, it's irrelevant. But if you don't, that is one clarification that's important to know, is that this is naturally going to build out your product life cycle. And this is going to be your product timeline and your roadmap, which is actually really fun to look back on as you're going through this. So your product's up there, and per product you do one. Leap of faith assumption, we talked about that a little bit, but that's really like the one thing you're betting the farm on for the product as a whole. So what is the problem that you think you're going to solve and that you're willing to invest all your time, money, energy, staff's and skills into to try to solve? And that's a massive assumption, and you should know that more than anything else, because you should really know where you stand when you're placing bets like that. And then each of these are individual testing criteria, and I'm going to go through kind of the 6 things that we that we think are really important for testing. So first one, know your engine of growth assumption. And that was that second box up, or the far right one. And this is per product level. So knowing your engine of growth assumption at the product level, not your individual experiments. So we're going to talk about the product as a whole and then individual experiments. And you must define this so that you have something to be accountable to today and to your assumptions of what you think it's going to be. And this could change in the future, which is fine, but it's really important to write down what you think it is today. Most would just define their engine. Most would say that here's what our engine of growth is, but I would really argue that your engine of growth in itself, for a new product especially, is really an assumption until you've truly validated it. And so a lot of people really believe like this is where our customers are coming from, and this is what our engine of growth is, but they don't really have true metrics to define that. And so that's why I call it an assumption on our testing board versus like actual fact. So three kind of main categories that break into your engine of growth. The first one is your paid customer acquisition, which everyone's super familiar with, advertising, affiliate marketing, sponsorships, stuff like that. The second category is lean, like Eric Ries would call it sticky growth. Most of you would know that as organic growth. And that's the product itself carrying a way for customers to evangelize your product without doing it intentionally. So example of that would be you're listening to satellite radio in your car and your friends are there and they hear a commercial or they like the radio, so they're unintentionally marketed to based on your customer experience or wearing product brand names, right? So me having my Mac here on stage or someone wearing Beats headphones and walking down the park and people seeing them. And so they're unintentionally marketing it and it creates viral growth based on this exposure. So, or sticky growth. So it sticks with other people based on its exposure. And the last one is viral growth. And so viral growth I break down into kind of three different sections. One would be intentional. And this is where a user is incentivized to market your product for you. So Dropbox is a great example of that. You run out of Dropbox space. They say, hey, invite your friend over here. We'll give you an extra 5 megabytes of space. And so you invite your friend with a very intentional reason of marketing someone else's product so that you can get a benefit from it. So that's one way that viral growth happens. The second way is unintentional. So if you're sending out newsletters, and let's say you're using MailChimp and you want to use the free plan, so you pump out your newsletter, send it to all your followers, and at the bottom MailChimp sticks a quick little marketing message and their logo in it. You are sending a newsletter for whatever your content was because you want to market to your customer, but you unintentionally marketed someone else's product and that creates viral growth for them. And then the last one is social currency. So it's funny, there's a lot of sociology and psychology science being studied right now in marketing, which has been really fun, but talking about like why do people do the things they do, like why are they incentivized to share products? And one of the big things is social currency. So this is like word of mouth. So I'm going to share a product with you that I'm excited about, but why would I do it? It's because there's a social currency to it. So if I'm the lean expert and I know that something's coming out and I get exposed to something that Eric just did or the Lean Institute, and I share it with my friend, it gives me value, makes me seem like I'm carrying something of value, and I give it to my friend, and I'll dispense it freely because it gives me some sort of social currency. And you see this with anyone that like, it's your friend that knows everything there is to know about football or whatever. Like, why is he so enthusiastic to promote every trade that happened in the Broncos? It's giving him some sort of social currency to have value in conversations in public. So to summarize those, knowing your growth, your engine of growth assumption is really important. And just writing it down, and it may change, but it's really good to say, this is what I think it's going to be, and then you have something to measure it against. And so, and when you do it, don't do the three categories. So it's not going to be paid customer acquisition or sticky growth or viral growth. It's going to be something very specific, like affiliate marketing or word of mouth or intentional user adoption. But the more specific you can define it, the more you're starting to get to know who your customer is or your target customer. So, yeah, that's just where it is on the tool that we have. The second thing is to conduct multiple tests and review them against each other. So, when I say that, the one thing I want to clarify, don't conduct multiple tests at the same time. That's a recipe for failure because you're not going to really be able to determine what's causing what output. So conducting multiple tests. As you saw, we have a line per test, and the idea is that you need to continue to test. So take one small bite, test one thing, get your answers, roll that into the next test. But you need to have multiple tests, and then you're comparing them against each other. And like I said, when you're done, after you've done 10 tests, it's actually really insightful because you can see here was our assumption, here was the output, here's what we did, here was our pivot. And you can start looking at your own behavior, and you can see like we're always over, or we're spot on, or and regardless, at the end, you do 10 tests in a row, I promise your product will be in a radically different spot. Like 10 tests would be the equivalent of building like a product a week for 10 weeks. So you're going to want to document them. You want to track your product roadmap. I already talked about that. Yeah, and the last thing is that all your tests should be pointing in the same direction. So they should all be taking small bites of a bigger test that you're trying to validate. So for us at Osana, we make the mosquito repellent soap. We have a corporate mission. Our leap of faith assumption is that we can eliminate all the preventable deaths caused by mosquito-borne illnesses around the world. There's 1.8 million of them, and that's what we're setting out to do. Now, if our first test was, let's go do this really cool affiliate marketing strategy, and then we assume that all 1.8 million people are not going to die this year because of mosquito-borne illnesses, it would be foolishness, right? So all of our tests are going to align into the bigger mission or a bigger leap of faith assumption, but they should all be pointing in the same direction as the point of that. So you're going to have multiple tests, make sure they're all pointing in the same direction and running after your bigger leap of faith assumption. So with this, really critical to understand your macro and your micro leap of faith assumptions. So we talked about the macro one already, and that's really everything you're willing to bet the farm on. Like, why are you, like, you're putting all your effort into this one big problem. For us, we believe that we can eliminate those preventable deaths. Your micro leap of faith assumption is, what are you assuming that you're going to create this test for? So every test has, let's see, yeah. So each line is a test for us, and like I said, you don't have to use our tool. I'm just using this for illustrative purposes. I do think all these points in the test are important, but the tool is not as important. So for each test, we have our main leap of faith assumption, and then we're going to write out our experiment, and then we're going to write what's our assumption. Like, what are we assuming is going to happen? So we assume, and this gets kind of mixed up with your solution and your assumption. The solution is, what are you going to do, which I'm going to define in a moment. The assumption is, what do you think is going to happen because you do it? So we are going to run an affiliate marketing campaign, and we assume that we're going to get 200 new customers in 1 week. That's the assumption that I'm writing, right? So because we're always assuming that something's going to happen based on the output that we have. So I'm going to go back to this. So you need to know your macro and your micro leaps of faith assumptions, and they should be different, and the micro one should be tied to the individual test that you're doing. And yeah, it's some of the value in this is this allows you, either if you're running the test or if you're a manager, what's our metric that everyone's held accountable to? Like, at the end of this, when we say we invested this time and resources, we agreed, the test was approved, what were we expecting to happen? That's what we're expecting to happen, and everyone can go back and look at it and say, we didn't hit our mark, or we did, we blew it away, whatever. But you need to have that baseline. Fourth thing, you need to define your customer problem, and the solution. So before you test, you must know exactly who your target customer is, right? And too often businesses don't take the time to define their customer, and thus they're trying to solve problems for every potential user, right? And that's really going to get you nowhere. And I think Lean as a methodology in a whole has really pressed in on that really well and explained all the reasons why, so I won't elaborate there. But you have to know who they are. Some companies go as far as they put a picture in the office of who their target customer. What does he look like? He or she, what's their name? I mean, and to the specifics. So he's a hipster that wears short pant or tight jeans that are brown. He has glasses, a long beard. His name's John. His favorite beer is this. He always hangs out at the coffee shop, and when he has a free dollar, he goes to a movie theater or a comic store. Like, really defining like who their target customer is, and then they put a name on them, and then they typically use that all throughout their company, and they say, okay, if their target customer's name was John, they would bring John into everything they're doing. So his name would be everywhere, and it helps you personalize who are you developing this for. Instead of just an audience, now you're developing it for a person. So know your customer. You need to define who they are. Second thing is you need to define your customer problem. So Yeah, like Jay-Z, your customers have 99 problems, but you really are only looking to solve one of those. Like they probably have thousands of problems, right? And you wanted to solve one of those. If you try to solve multiple problems, you're really gonna be ineffective at what you're doing. So you need to choose one per test. Again, your main leap of faith assumption is solving a lot of problems. Individual tests should be one problem at a time. And if you do that effectively, you're gonna find a reason for them to come back and be a repeat customer. And you're just, without that focus, you're not going to have the impact to get them to solve something worth paying you for. And when I say pay, if I say paying at all in this, I recognize not everyone is taking revenue from their customers, so sometimes it's you're wanting a customer to take an action or to do something. So anytime I say paying for, globally I'm saying the call to action that you're looking for your customer to do in exchange for the services you're offering. And then you have to define your solution. And again, this is different than the assumption. So the assumption is the result. I'm assuming this will happen. The solution is we're going to implement this affiliate marketing system. So we're going to reach out to our top 100 customers that have the highest revenue with us. We're going to send them a newsletter that says we're launching the affiliate program on this day. Then we're going to personally call each one of them and tell them why they should join. And then we're going to build, this is the technology we're using to implement it. So like all the specifics. Here's the roadmap, like this is what we're doing for this test. This is the solution that we're building. And sometimes that feels a little tedious, but that's like the whole exercise is documenting everything that you're doing so you have something to go back and compare to. The fifth thing is to define your experiment, your success criteria, and your time frame. So define your experiment, and I actually overspoke when I was talking about the solution. So the solution will be like a summary so that you can bring it to the boss or the owner and say this is what we want to do, and then the experiment is actually how you're going to implement it. So all those details that I just mentioned. So sorry for mixing those two, but that really becomes your MVP. So the defining the experiment becomes the new MVP. What's the minimum viable product you're building to validate that test that you want to do? And then you have your success criteria. So success criteria is like I said, like we believe, like to be successful, we need to have 200 new customers by the end of this test. And so that's your success criteria. So it gives you an opportunity to say continue down the path or make a pivot. If you make it, you can continue down the path. If you don't, it's like an automatic force for you to take a pivot. And then they have to be specific. So your metrics, you need to use specific metrics. If you say we want to have customer growth or more customer acquisition, or we want people to have more page views, like that's as pointless as peeing in the wind. You need to be very specific to what you're doing. So we want to have 20 customers by this specific date, and so time frame and success criteria go very much hand in hand. Without having a time frame, a test is also pointless. So if you write out a really great metric and you say we want to have 20 new customers and 400 new page views per day, and you don't set a timeline, it's extremely pointless. So is that in 1 day? Is that in 10 years? And if that timeline's long, it's not really a metric. That's just what's going to happen by doing business as usual. You're going to hit that metric anyway. So really need to have a timeline, and it's pretty simple. It's like 2 weeks, 4 weeks, whatever. I'd recommend that in a test, you never do a timeline more than 90 days. At that point, you're trying to build something too big. Like you should be breaking your product into smaller pieces where you can make smaller tests. Yep. So, and then, yeah, the success criteria. So I talked about kind of pointless metrics where they're not specific, but also the wrong metrics that are important to know. So a bad example of wrong metrics to report on is if you're a membership site and you're looking at page views. So if you, let's say each month you say, man, our page views went up 100,000, next month 120,000, next month 140,000. As a business, you're like, we're doing great, this is amazing. Your success criteria is actually new member signups. It's not how many pages are being viewed on your site, although that's a great metric for most websites. You're a membership website. You want more people to sign up. So if you're having incredible page view growth, that means that your content's really great, but you have a problem with converting your customers. So having specific metrics is really, really important. Yeah, that's almost out. So, and this, to me, this is like really where you start working smarter than harder. Like you define your test, you create your success criteria, and you create your timeline. It forces you into this place where you are working smarter. You're not creating these huge, elaborate 12-month product life cycle or business plans. Like you're doing really small things, and you're winning on them. So, like just psychology science would say, like, make your bed in the morning. For the simple fact of if everything else goes wrong, you did one thing right, and you come home and you have a clean bed to get back into. Small wins make a huge difference, and don't underestimate the power of momentum. So you start doing these small tests and you implement one successfully and you gain a win from it. There's nothing more motivating than to do it. But if you're trying to go accomplish, if you're trying to climb the 14er in an hour and then you don't do it, there's failure sets in, and that's reverse momentum. So don't underestimate the value of making these tests small and getting into a constant cycle of doing them. So the last thing on the testing tool and how to test really is measure your results, conclude your decisions, and document your validated learnings. This all takes time, not a whole lot of time. I would argue that you could do it in 10 minutes or less, but this would be the one thing that most people would skimp on. So they come up with this brilliant idea, like, I want to do this thing. They put all this thought into how are we going to execute it. Then they go work really hard to execute the plan, and then they write out their, and then when they're done, they write out all their metrics, like, here's what we did, or along the way you're writing out your metrics. And then they get to the end, and it's like, okay, this was really great, and then they're just kind of ready to move on. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where great products pull ahead, driving specific value for their customers' actual problems, while average products get further and further behind, trying to solve a problem that the customer doesn't have, or creating the wrong solution for the customer's correct problem. You have to be able to go back and review. So debrief, like, your best musicians in the world all do this. SEAL Team 6 do this. Best corporate executives do this. They know that what we have to do is go review what we've done well, what we didn't do well, and have that be input into the next thing that we start out to do. So at the end of this, you got to measure your results and conclude your decisions. So you got to make decisions based on what you found, and you're creating validated learnings on this. What's nice is that if you choose to do multiple tests, this actually wipes out the next step of creating your next test. They become one. So as you're determining your validated learnings, it's automatically setting up what's my next testing criteria. Like, what's the next thing that I want to do, because you just learned something and now you're ready to implement that. So if you're doing them consistently, it's actually not a lot of extra work, and you can do two things at once with that. Yep, and that's, at the end we have that. So all that to say, have a tool that works and doesn't get in the way. Using the wrong tool is no different than solving the wrong customer problem. Both highly, highly ineffective. So whatever you use, again, just find something that works for you and use it consistently and standardize it amongst your people. So ongoing strategies to keep it in front of you. Do this as a team if you're not an individual contributor. Get your whole team to buy into it. As a manager or an owner, this is a crazy powerful tool. So instead of having long meetings and having our staff come up to me and say, hey, I really want to do this, and we're going to do this, this, and this, I can just say, hey, what's the experiment you want to do? And in one line, I can read 12 hours of their thought, right? I can know, like, what's the thing that they're wanting to test, what do they think we can do as a business, and how are they going to execute it? How much resources is this going to take us as a business? And I can read it in one line, and it's really easy for me to get thumbs up, thumbs down, or feedback like, hey, I want to do this, but let's choose to use these resources, or this is the wrong metric we're trying to measure. So if you do it as a team, and especially if you're in management and you get your whole team to do it, it's going to make your job really, really good, because now you're forcing people to start thinking like leaders. So they have to think through the problem, they have to think through the solution, how are they going to measure it, what are they held accountable to. You're creating leaders in your company, so it's a really powerful thing to do as a team and to implement to those below you. The other thing that I recommend is printing it out. So I know that it's 2016, but having something to do to keep it physically in front of you is really important. So we've lost a few trees with it, but I think it's been worth it. We have a physical board where we can keep it in front of us as a company. So there's nothing that's more reminding than having a physical reminder in front of you. If you really don't want to print something, a quick example would be have it in like a shared spreadsheet. that we provide or that you guys create on your own, and just have that as a favorite tab that comes up every morning. So you look at it like, here's the test, what am I doing? Okay, this is what I'm supposed to be doing for the next 2 weeks. The last thing is, or not last, but the next thing would be incorporating it into your daily work habits. So we do sprints, so we do a little bit of agile stuff in my company, but we kind of pick and choose what works for us, and one of those things is sprints. So we do 2-week sprint periods where we create specific objectives and things we have to accomplish in those 2 weeks, and we've been doing that forever. And we just implemented our lean startup experiments into those sprints. So we get to a sprint, everyone shows up, they talk about what did I do the last 2 weeks, what am I going to do the next 2 weeks, and here's my test results, or here's the new test that I want to run. And it allows us to have a very quick meeting and accomplish a lot because everyone's coming prepared. And so our tests are usually 2 weeks to 4 weeks. So it doesn't mean that they're doing a test every time, but we just have it whenever it falls within our normal daily activities. So what I would say is a way to kind of keep this in front of you so it doesn't get lost is incorporate it in something that's already routine in your company. And then, that's helping you build the habit. So if it's not a habit, this is going to be a waste of time. Like really, like you do 1 or 2 experiments, it's just not going to be valuable. The value of this is reiterative innovation and continual development. So build, measure, learn from that, and apply that to the next build. If you're not applying it, then it's what you learned is kind of pointless. So with this, just kind of wrapping up, a couple of free resources. If you guys want it, the ebook that we sell on Amazon, we'll give it to you for free if you mention Never Settle IT on Facebook or Twitter. You can mention me too. Either way, it doesn't matter. And then if you want the Lean Experiment tool, which is the printout and also the shared spreadsheets and the Excel spreadsheets and all that, just neversettle.it/DSW16 for Denver Startup Week.